Hi everyone, in today's video I will explain how do you control or address the subject and experimenter effects in your research. In my previous video I explained what is subject and experimenter effects, so I'll give you a quick recap of what they are, and then I will take you through the different methods you can employ to control for these. So the previous video where I explained the subject and experimental effects, the link is in the description section below. But just to give you a quick recap, remember subject effects are those effects caused by the participants not behaving as they normally would in a natural setting or when under observation, especially because they know that they are being observed. And there are some other reasons for it, which I've discussed in my previous video. And then experimental effects are those effects which again threaten the internal validity of an experimental research or quasi-research due to the bias caused by the researcher's own personal characteristics or verbal cues provided by the researcher, which kind of indicate to the participants as to what is the outcome expected from the data collection. So that was a quick recap. Let's get started with how you can control for these and what are the different methods you can employ. So the first method that you can employ is single or double blind procedures. Now, what is a single blind procedure? A single blind procedure is where the researcher himself or herself does not get involved necessarily in the way the research is being implemented or the design is being implemented. They design the research, of course, they can also collect the data if they want to, but it is the researcher's assistant who runs the study. However, the researcher's assistant does not know the conditions to which each participant is assigned. So here I will give you an example of the what we call as an experimental design, where you may have two groups of people. One group which may be subjected to the drug or a medicine, and the other group subjects to a placebo, which actually does not have the medicine but looks exactly like the medicine. And the intention behind this is the researcher wants to investigate the effects of the drug on the participants who are consuming the drug. So in one case they consume it, and the other case they don't consume it, but the participants don't know who is the control group or who's the placebo group, or sometimes they do know who's the control group and placebo group. Um, that is a single blind procedure. So what this basically means is the single blind procedure, the researcher's assistant basically allots the people in the two groups. The researcher doesn't know who's being allotted into which group, and then uh, the researcher's assistant may administer the drugs to the groups as well. However, the researcher can later on come in and collect the data as required. And in the double blind procedure, both the researcher and the participants become blind to the assignment of each participant to the condition. So what this means is the researcher's assistant not only runs the study, so he or she allots the two groups, randomly assigns people, and then when they assign the placebo drug or the actual drug, he or she does not even inform the researcher, and neither the participants know. So in a single blind study, the participants may know, the researcher may know who's actually consuming the real drug and the placebo drug, but the way the experiments are run, the way the groups are being allotted, and the conditions of the study is completely controlled by the researcher's assistant, and the participants do not get much influence from the researcher in trying to demonstrate an outcome as the researcher is expecting. So the researcher has no control over the choice of participants. And in the double blind, of course, the researcher and the participants both don't know who is being administered the control drug or the placebo drug, and the researcher basically just comes in later and collects the data and reveals the findings based on what he or she has found in their research. However, remember one thing here, that in certain conditions or in certain studies, the using placebo control groups in psychological research is more difficult than in drug related studies. And this is because that, let's say you have two groups of people, one group which is being subjected to the therapy or the therapeutical treatment, And if the other group is just being told that they are subjected to the therapeutical effect, but actually they are not, they may be able to find out, because in psychological research, when you have to administer a therapy, it is very difficult for you to act as if you are giving therapy but not doing so. Whereas in drugs, you may have two drugs which look very similar, and the participants won't know whether they are having the actual drug or the placebo. But in psychological research, where the therapy is involved, the participants would know whether it's just an acting or whether it's actual therapy or whether it's pretend therapy. So they might find out. They might find out. They may not always so, but they might find out. Another thing you have to remember in these kind of studies is that in certain medical research, it becomes very unethical to give placebo treatment to the participants without their consent. This is especially when you are trying to test the effects of a new drug. Let's say you have designed a new drug and you want to test its effects on cancer or curing cancer. Now, there could be certain participants who want to be treated by the treatment by the new drug, because they want to cure the cancer, they want to cure themselves, they want to live a long life. But if you give them the placebo without them knowing it, then they are hoping to get cured, and then if they realize it later that they were just given a placebo, and time has passed, and they could have been saved when they were not, then that creates unethical issues, and that may create a problem overall as well. The other way you can control for subject effects and experimental effects is automation. By automation, I mean the more use of technology that you can. So this automation basically distances you as the researcher from the participants, so that you cannot influence them directly by your presence. So you may use emails to employ them or engage them, distribute studies, not demonstrate any body language or body cues or non-verbal cues in trying to get an outcome that you want to get from them. You may observe them using monitors and screens without them knowing it. Again, there are some ethical issues, but yes, most of the time you can do that. If you are observing them without them knowing it, then also they don't get influenced, and they don't behave they behave exactly how they normally would, and not change their behavior because someone is observing them. So you can use some technology based equipment or technology based softwares which distance you as a researcher from the participant. The third way is that you start using objective measures here instead of subjective measures. So for example, you are trying to study the impact of public speaking on research participants, and instead of an example of subjective measure is that you are looking at research participants and you think that somebody is nervous, whereas they may not be. So this comes down to your interpretation of their body language, which may not always be accurate, especially if you are not a body language expert and you have not employed one. So you can see on your left side of the screen, you may look at somebody and think that they are nervous and they are shaking, and but inside they might be very confident. It's just how they're coming across. So your interpretation without objective measures may be incorrect, whereas more objective measures would be having somebody sweating. So if you see someone sweating and wiping the sweat repeated times, or them not being able to speak properly, stammering, not being able to hold conversations, respond to people's queries, or have them shaking hands, these are all objective measures. So you can actually have a panel of people and give them cues and say that observe these behaviors. So if you observe these behaviors, that is a sign of anxiety in during public speaking. Whereas if you don't give anybody any cues, or you are just the one observing it, and based on your own observation, your own interpretation of body language, you are trying to determine whether anxiety occurs during public speaking or not, they are more subjective and may not stand ground in front of reviewers, examiners who are reading your research. Then you may have multiple observers as well. So instead of having single observers, so for example, you are trying to observe the behavior of wild animals in the wildlife settings or in enclosed spaces, then you observing the behavior yourself, and is less reliable than having multiple raters. So when you have multiple raters and they are observing the behaviors, then you can see how they have rated those behaviors and get a statistic out of it. There's a kappa statistic where they are given a base rate. So what does that mean is that you basically provide cues and signals to your panel of observers or a panel of raters, and tell them that these are the behaviors I expect you to observe, these are the signs of these behaviors, so if you observe them, please take. And then based on what they have achieved, what they have observed, you can rate them in terms of agreement. So you can have a percentage of agreement between the raters on certain behaviors, certain cues, certain performances of maybe students in assessments. So rather than you singly doing it and individually doing it, and especially if you don't have any indicators or markers or signals and cues. So having multiple observers will also help you address the experimenter effect in research. And finally, of course, multiple observers are normally kept separate from each other, and they may and they are given, like I told you, they are given signals and cues from which they can read or study and mark the behaviors of the research participants as per the sheet that you have provided them. So they are also objective in their behavior. They are strictly following the sheet, and that sheet pretty much makes it gives you objective indicators of research participants' behavior. Finally, you may also use deception as a means of addressing experimenter and subject effects. And what do I mean by deception or deceiving the research participants is where the researcher may mislead or hide information about the purpose of the research uh, from the research participants. And I'll give you an example here. If you have heard of Milgram's experiment, so in Milgram's experiment, what the researcher did was he hired an actor, and they connected electrical pulses to them and told somebody to come and give shock uh, to the um, to the research participant to see how much a research participant conforms to the instructions given by the researcher, just because the researcher looks like he's a scientist. So a researcher dressed up, of course he dressed up in a lab coat, for example, and pretended to be a very knowledgeable scientist, or pretended to be a doctor, and asked research participants to come in and subject the actor to electrical shocks, and kept increasing the voltage of those electrical shocks. And as the actor kept screaming, some of the research participants kept giving increased voltage of shocks, just because the researcher was telling them to do so. So this was a study done to see how people conform, or how people just listen or follow people's instructions because they look like a scientist, or they look like a doctor. And that was one of the reasons the research was conducted. This was of course banned later on, because a lot of the research participants got disturbed by the actor's screams. So the actor was screaming in anguish, and they were pretending to be in pain. But even that was not stopping some of the research participants from increasing the voltage and giving them increased shocks, just because the researcher, who was dressed up like a scientist, was telling them to do so and saying that I am conducting this research and please listen to me and follow my instructions. So the research participants were ignoring and the cries of help of the actor, and that was studying human behavior. So here, of course, the researcher was misleading and hiding the information about the purpose of the research from the research participants. And sometimes this can also be done in experimental versus control procedures, or treatment versus control groups, where I told you before is that you can give placebo to somebody and then the actual drug to someone, and hide the information as to who has got the placebo and who has got the actual drug. Again, there could be some ethical issues depending on the kind of research you're doing, but this is again one way, deception or deceiving the participants, not telling them exactly why you are studying them, or what research you're doing, or what hypothesis you are expecting to prove, and getting the responses from them, or getting the behaviors from them as you would in natural setting. So thank you for watching today's video, guys. These are different ways to address the subject and experimental effects. If there is anything I have missed, please make sure that you put it in the comment section, and keep watching my videos, subscribe to them, and bye for now.